Ah, Trabuco. I remember when I first joined, as Swami said, in 1962, when I came here, and it's the same. But the surroundings weren't the same. I remember driving in here, and when you got to the junction of the freeway and El Toro Road, and as you drive up El Toro Road, not a sign of civilization hardly. No commercial development, nothing, except there was a little country store, the El Toro Country Store. But between that and driving on up, just Cook's Corner. That was the only thing. And oh, what a change. When I left here in 1974, Leisure World was bustling down below. And I remember Sears had opened. And we even had something called Lions Country Safari, where they had wild animals roaming around, and you could drive through them in your car. So what a change, and yet Trabuco's the same. And that's the amazing thing about being here. When I come back here, I feel like I'm in a time warp. I feel like the surroundings have completely changed. Trabuco, with all its atmosphere, it's just the same. And I'm so pleased to be able to talk to you about what Trabuco was like at that time. But before I do that, I have to tell you a little bit about not only how I came here, but how I came to Vedanta. Well, I was exposed at an early age. My mother came to Vedanta when I was 10 years old. And we lived in Kansas City, Missouri. And she had met a friend. And the friend told her that she had met a marvelous man in St. Louis. And that marvelous man was Swami Prabhavananda, who was head of the Vedanta Society in St. Louis. Well, my mother immediately went and had an appointment with her. And he gave her instruction and suggested they start a small Vedanta society in Kansas City. And so they started one in our house, and they would have recordings and play tapes of the Swami's talks. But I couldn't be less interested. I wasn't interested at all. And even when I grew up in high school, I remember they'd play the tapes for my father and I'd be watching television while they were listening to the Swami's tapes in the other room. And then I remembered when I was smaller, my mother sitting kind of cross-legged. I wonder what in the world is she doing? And I said, "Hey, mother." And I couldn't understand why she got so mad when I interrupted her. But then, of course, later that I realized that she was meditating and didn't want to be disturbed. Well, as I grew up, I wasn't much interested in religion. My great interest was theater. Theater was my interest. The background I had probably stemmed from my mother. My mother was a star on Broadway, a dancing star in the 1920s, and not only in Broadway, but also in London. And so I think my theater interest probably came from her. And after she retired, she started teaching dancing in Kansas City and had a company there locally and put on certain shows, and I participated in them. I wasn't much of a dancer, but I did do some pantomime. But later it led me into acting and so forth. So I decided, though, if I wanted to be in theater, you'd want to make a living at it, you don't go into the professional theater. So I decided the way I would do it is go into the educational theater. So I decided I'd be a speech teacher, a speech and drama speech teacher. So I went to Northwestern University, which was very highly acclaimed for that kind of a department, and didn't have too much interest. I remember my mother came up to Chicago and dragged me to the dedication of the new Vedanta place, their new center in Chicago, and I remember going to that. But other than that, I didn't have much contact, although I'd met, of course, Swami Prabhavananda, and he was very nice to me. But then as I went on, I remember that something was bothering my mind. It wasn't, looking back, it was rather trivial, but still, it was just sort of bothering my mind. And suddenly dawned on me, something doesn't bother you unless you think about it. And I said, well, I've seen some books around here, something about controlling the mind. So I asked my mother, do you have any books or any advice on how you can control your mind? Well, that was the opening she'd been waiting for. Up to then, she'd been very cautious about trying to push me into anything like that. But then she saw that I had some interest, so she whisked me off to St. Louis, and I had my first interview there with Swami Prabhavananda. And then I went back to teaching, and I'm trying to do this thing called meditation. And I'm getting along as well as can be expected. But then, when I was directing a play, it was like double Maya. Not only were you thinking about the normal distractions, but all you could think about were all the problems of the play. And so I did that, and then I got a little bit more interested in it, and I came to the conclusion, if you really believe the message of Vedanta, and you're free to do so, then why not devote your whole life to what Vedanta says? So I thought, well, maybe then I should consider going to a monastery, because that would be the logical place to go if you wanted to devote your whole life to it. And so after teaching for 2 years in Kansas City, and I'd also I taught for 4 years, actually. I taught way out in western Kansas. I remember there I got so starved for theater in western Kansas, having lived in Kansas City and then near Chicago, that I went at Christmas time to New York and saw 14 shows in 10 days and made up for it. But as I got uninterested then, I went to Swami Prabhavananda and said, Swami, I'm thinking about joining the monastery. The first thing he said, a monastery is not for you. And then I got a little bit taken aback. Then I realized, looking back, well, that's what you say. You're trying to make sure that a person is really interested. Just like if you'd go to an acting teacher and say, oh, I want to be an actor. Well, really, their first job is to discourage them from going into such a overcrowded profession. So I think they're just testing your sincerity and how much you want to do it. But later on, he modified it a bit. And he was more familiar in one way with the Vedanta Society of Northern California. And they had this big retreat north of San Francisco, Wilima, in Marin County. And he looked at me and said, no, a monastery is not for you. They're felling trees at Wilima. And so I went back. Well, I decided, after I had decided to go into the monastery, I'm going to go out monastery shopping. Well, at the time, there were only 2 places you could go, and that was on the West Coast, Northern California and Southern California. Well, I went out, and I visited Swami Vivekananda in Seattle, and took in this World's Fair, which was going on. And then I went. Now, I was more attracted towards Northern California for several reasons, the San Francisco Center, because, I knew about Southern California. How could you not? I mean, I'd read the books that came from here, the magazines and all that, but it just seemed so overwhelming. It just seemed like it'd be a beehive of just too much activity, and you would get lost out here in Hollywood and so forth. So I aimed my sights at San Francisco. And so I went there. Another reason I was attracted, I remember my first year out of college, I went to San Francisco. I had relatives who lived in Concord over in the Bay, and I made a 45-minute travelogue of San Francisco. So I was quite attracted to the city itself. And then when I got there and saw the old temple, and they were so nice to me, and I had an interview with Swami Ashokananda, who was the head, and I told him what Swami Prabhavananda had said, that, it's not for you, they're felling trees at Olima. And he said, that's okay, we'll find little trees for you to fell. And so I felt fairly comfortable there. I liked it. And I looked around the center, and the people were very nice. I loved the old temple. And decided, yeah, probably the place for me. In the meantime, my folks were out in Laguna Beach, and they were visiting my father's sister at Laguna Beach, so I had to go down and see them. And I talked to my mother and said, yes, I think I want to join the monastery in San Francisco. And she was saying something about Southern California over here. And so, no, I didn't want to hear anything about Vedanta Society of Southern California. My heart was in San Francisco. So I went back up to San Francisco. I wanted to see the other places. They had Lima, of course, which I mentioned, in Sacramento. And so I was staying at the old temple and made arrangements to go to Lima. Well, when I went up to Lima and I got a little bit, well, what's going on here? I saw they had these roads. They were building roads. And I saw this. All the construction activity was going on. And I thought, well, I started to get a little cold feet. I'm not quite sure. And so I went back to San Francisco. Well, one experience I had there, I was very fortunate that I got to hear Swami Ashokananda speak twice. And I'll never forget it. I remember the first time when I was there, and he looked out at the audience and said, I remember this was at the height of the hippie movement in San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury and all of that. He said to the audience, San Francisco, very fortunate city, yogis on every street corner. And then I talked to him, and I said I had sort of second thoughts, Swami. I went up to Lima and saw how the roads were being built, and he said, now you don't think we've been waiting all these years for you to come and build our roads to you? And so I said, well, no. So I was arranged to go to Sacramento the next day to see the other center. And that night, the old temple, I had some kind of an experience. I don't know what it was, but I felt the walls were closing in on me. And I couldn't get out of that place fast enough. And I felt maybe the Lord was telling me something, that maybe San Francisco is not the place for you. And I talked to Swami Ashokananda that morning and said, oh, Swami, I think maybe I'm not quite ready to go on to Sacramento. And he said, well, why don't you go to Southern California? You might look it over there, and you might like that. And so that's what I did. So I came back down to Laguna Beach with my folks. Meantime, my mother had already been to Trabuco. She fell in love with the place. And so we made arrangements that we were going to go to Hollywood and to meet Swami Prabhavananda. And to there, and at the time, Swami Pavitrananda was giving the talk, the guest talk. And Swami Pavitrananda was being introduced by Swami Prabhavananda. That was the first time I saw him. And then after the talk, had the introductions, and he looked at me and said, why don't you go to Trabuco and stay permanently? So I felt that was very nice. And we went back to Laguna Beach. Later, it was quite interesting that much, much later, after I had joined, and my mother had come out for visits or so, he told us that while he was there during the talk, when Swami Pavitrananda was speaking, Swami Prabhavananda kept looking at my mother. He said he did not know why she was looking at my mother, but all he knew was that she belonged to Ramakrishna. And then he found out later that she was a disciple of Swami Saprakashananda. And so she made an impression. Reminds me too, when I went to India, my first trip, when the president of the whole Ramakrishna order was Swami Ranganathananda, who spent 2 or 3 years touring around here in the Western centers. He'd actually come to Kansas City when we had our center there. And so I knew my parents. And so the first thing he did when I met him in India in the president's office, he said, "Your mother was a wonderful woman." So I felt like I came from a very good background with that. Well, anyway, went back to Laguna, and Swami Prabhavananda at the time was staying at South Laguna. The Swami Prabhavananda would host guest swamis during the summer at this devotee's house in South Laguna. And so we were going to go down there before we went back. And I remember we went to the house, and who would come to open the door and usher us in? First thing we heard was, "I'm Christopher Isherwood." And oh my goodness, we thought all the books we had read and the articles he had read about him, and we kind of felt overwhelmed. Here we were being brought into the house by Isherwood himself. And then we visited with the Swamis a bit, and then I came back to Kansas City, and I resigned my teacher's contract and decided that, yes, that Trabuco in Southern California was the place for me. And so I came back and I joined Trabuco. 62 years this very fall was when I came into Trabuco. And then I was introduced here and to the schedule. Now the schedule here was pretty regular. We had, at the time, I believe it were 6 or 8 monks living here. They were Westerners. And the schedule was that we had our meals, of course, and then time to do the work. We had certain work periods, then a certain bit of leisure period. But the most important thing were the meditation sessions. And Swami Prabhavananda always emphasized that no special austerities or really scripture studies or anything, but the main thing was the meditation, and we were to be in the shrine for an hour in the morning, and then at noon, and then in the evening. And that was the main thing. And so that was the great thing that Trabuco offered, and that was our major schedule. The work and what we did varied, but the main things were the regular schedule. Now we had with us at the time, living with us practically all the time, was Swami Bandhanananda, who had come about 10 years earlier to the Hollywood Center, and he was the resident Swami at Trabuco. And he was with us almost all the time, even when he would speak in Hollywood. So he had a Thursday night class. He would go Thursday afternoon and come back that evening after the class. And so the only time he wasn't with us was when he went up to Santa Barbara, because even when he went to Hollywood, he would go in the morning and come back that evening. So we were with him all the time, practically. And that was great, because if we had any problems, and you do have problems when you're in a monastery, people go on certain other places, might have austerities, but the main austerity that we had was group living. And that is common to any kind of group community, but that was the main austerity. So with Swami Bandhanananda, we could go to him anytime, and we could discuss our personal problems, and he guided us, and so we're very fortunate. And he became certainly a major figure when he left. He left in 1969, went back to India. 2 years later, he became the General Secretary of the whole Ramakrishna order. So we felt very blessed that he was there. But then, of course, what really made Trabuco special was the regular visits of Swami Prabhavananda. Swami Prabhavananda founded the Vedanta Society of Southern California. And he had been in, obviously, on the beginning, and at Trabuco, when the Trabuco shifted from Gerald Hurd, when he had his Trabuco College, to the monastery. And so we were very blessed that Swami Prabhavananda, who came from the original sources back in India, the Ramakrishna, and not only was his guru, Swami Brahmaనంద, who Ramakrishna considered as a spiritual son, but he practically also knew all the many direct disciples. In fact, many times, different places, he talks about rooming with them. In India, it sounded like there was college buddies. So we were very blessed to have someone who not only knew all the direct disciples, most of them, and had contact with the Holy Mother, and was just completely immersed in it. We always thought how fortunate anybody who came to the source, because as in Vedanta, many, many people, we accept Ramakrishna as an incarnation of God, and then the direct disciples would be like Jesus' disciples. And so the direct disciples were, say, like St. Peter. And any disciples of them, you can say, well, my teacher was a disciple of St. Peter. And that's really a direct connection back to the God incarnation. Well, Swami Prabhavananda would come, and it was a different kind of a situation because, first of all, in Hollywood, which I was afraid of, and that was one of the reasons I didn't want to come, the buzzing beehive, which I saw in many of my visits, and I thought I'd get lost there, and how would you ever see Swami P and all that type of business? But in Trabuco, quite different. We're very, very, very fortunate because he would come to us. He'd talk in Hollywood. That evening he would come to Trabuco, and he would stay till after lunch on Wednesday. So we had that whole period with him. When let alone not being able to see him, he was completely approachable. He'd sit out there in the courtyard. You could come up to him at any time. Hollywood, sometimes they had to wait 3 months to get an appointment with him. Sometimes people got wise and they'd make an appointment with him down here, where they didn't have to wait so long. But he gave us the spiritual instruction anytime we needed it. Whereas Swami V, take care of any personal problems, but for spiritual instruction and that type of thing, you could go to Swami Prabhavananda anytime he was here, and he would listen. And it was really nice for us. I mean, we didn't have to do much when he came, nothing special, because he always had Swami Krishnananda with him. So he traveled with his attendant, so we didn't have to bustle around and do special things. We could just lay back and enjoy his company. And so that was nice. And it wasn't just spiritual. Swami Prabhavananda believed in everybody being well-rounded. And so quite often when he would come, he'd take us to the movies. And we'd go to the movies, all the group with Swami Prabhavananda. This might seem unusual, but of course he was in the heart of the Hollywood community. Many of the people who were coming to Vedanta that he knew were in the industry. And people came to see him, some of the movie stars. He used to joke that movie stars came to see him like most people go to see movie stars. So, and especially with his connection with Christopher Isherwood, who was in the industry, that he knew a lot of these people. So he wanted to keep up with what was going on, and so he thought that we should keep up with it. And so he would take us to the movies, and that was very enjoyable, and then to come back and talk about those. So you might say that we had a ball when Swami Prabhavananda came. Didn't have to do much extra, just enjoy his company. And then we were really fortunate in the summer, we got to see him more than Hollywood did. But the thing was you go to Hollywood, and it was such a bustling thing. We'd go occasionally up for special pujas and things like that, and have a visit with him in his room, but nothing like what we had with his comradeship here at Trabuco. But once a year, this devotee that I mentioned, who lived in South Laguna and had a house there, Ruth Conrad, she would turn over the house to Swami, and he would invite these visiting Swamis to come, and we would go down and see them once a week. So we had more contact during the summer than either Santa Barbara or Hollywood did, and we always valued that because we could see Swami once a week when he was South Laguna, and we'd go down and visit with him and walk on the beach. It was quite a situation and very, very nice. And so that was the general, overall view of Trabuco. And of course, the greatest thing that here I come from just a little center, sub-center in Kansas City, which wasn't really a center, just here in our house. We were lucky if we saw Swami coming once a year, and we usually have to go to St. Louis, although Swami Prabhavananda might come. And then here I am in the heart, Bhadana Society of Southern California, the largest center in the country, and in this wonderful place, Trabuco Monastery. What a difference, and what a blessing I had to go from that to that. And so now we're going to have a short musical interlude, and then I'll tell you some of my memories and different things that Trabuco has meant to me and recalled, and I'd like to share them with you.
All right, this is just a little musical break so Atma can rest his vocal cords. A couple years ago, I wrote an oratorio on the mother aspects, and the bulk of it was on the Chandi. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Chandi, but since we just went through Durga Puja season and then Kali Puja, it relates well to that. The Chandi is what you could call the Gita of the Shaktas, and it tells the story of 3 episodes where the Divine Mother has to defeat demons, which are symbolic of the demons that are within us, the tamasic demons and the rajasic demons, and even the sattvic demons that are within us. So there are 4 famous hymns in the Chandi, and I'm going to play an adaptation of the second hymn for this particular musical interlude. And you have the lyrics here on this first sheet. So this hymn is sung after she has defeated one of the demons, and so she promises them that if they sing her praises, that she will come again. That happens right at the end of this particular one.
secret power to make and preserve and devour. Destroyer of evil and nature protects us from palaces truly momentous. The sound is your essence of being. The scriptures are some with great meaning. Intent on conferring the sense of belief. We send all the awesome scheme. We offer to you our orations, in gracious to all creation. We saw all the sorcerer's power defeated, his army that quickly retreated. Sing praises to Mother unlike any other, great words are a spell, but she can't be described. Sing praise to all power to make and devour. As soon as all being and granted believe, we offer orations for eternal creation. Sing praise.
Now I want to backtrack just a little bit and go back to when I was getting ready to join the monastery. Now you know that sometimes when people go to the monastery, there's opposition. There's opposition to them from their relatives, from their parents. And, well, of course I didn't have any opposition from my mother. She was all for it. She said that's what she would do if she had the opportunity. My father, he didn't care too much about it. He didn't really matter one way or another. And but my mother got a letter from one of her friends who knew about my interest in theater and said, oh, she was just shocked. She said, for the love of God, why would he join a monastery? Not knowing that she had answered her own question. But the only relatives that really opposed my coming happened to be the closest relatives geographically to Trabuco. And they lived in Laguna Beach, which is just about a 30-minute drive away. And, my aunt there, she just didn't know what was going on. When my folks were staying there before I joined here, and we were going to go to South Laguna to see the Swamis, my mother was calling up the house there to make advance arrangements. And my aunt was going around, oh my gosh, she's talking to a Swami. She's talking to a Swami. She closed the door, so she didn't want to hear what was going on. And so she was actively, didn't know what was going on, and she didn't like to think too much of her nephew that was living so close, being in not only a monastery, but a Hindu monastery. And as I say, they were my closest relatives geographically. And it was kind of interesting, too, because her son, Bob, was living out here. And not only that, he was working for Disney. He had married Walt Disney's younger daughter, Sharon. And he was working at WED, which was the division of Disney that produced the attractions for the theme parks in Disneyland. And his supervisor there just happened to be John Hinch, who was also one of our own board members at the Vedanta Society of Southern California. And I remember one summer, he picked up Bob, and they went to Switzerland on a research trip. And I thought, here's my aunt, so opposed to Vedanta, and her son is going around Switzerland with one of our board members. And I thought that was rather amusing. But later, she sort of came around, and I remember I was visiting her in Laguna, and she was introducing me to some of her friends. She said, now this is my nephew. He lives in that monastery. You know that monastery up there in the hills. And then I remember she came to lunch here. And so she kind of turned around. So then I thought that was quite interesting that happened. And so now going back to Trabuco, some of the random memories. Talking about visitors, this one impressed me, especially with my aunt coming. And going back to Trabuco, actually it was quite interesting. It was full circle. If you remember, I mentioned earlier that my mother came to Vedanta through a friend who had just met this man in St. Louis. Well, this friend, Gladys, turned out to have come out here and spent 2 weeks at Trabuco College. And no doubt when she was out here, she heard about the Vedanta work in St. Louis. And so she got interested in that and told my mother about it. And that's when we went to St. Louis. So I felt like it was full circle because it came from my Gladys being here at Trabuco College, and then my coming and joining Trabuco Monastery. So I thought that was quite interesting. One of our visitors, of course, we had Christopher Isherwood, who came down several times, and we got to know him and talk to him. And when I remember, for a very interesting reason, he was a professor in an Irish university, and he came down as one of the guests. And he was talking to us about the class he took in Sanskrit when he was going to school. And he said they were looking at one of the Upanishads, but not at all looking for it for the spiritual teachings it gave. They were working for it to find how many forms of the verb to be they could find in it. And I never forgot that. Here's reading one of the greatest scriptural things and looking for grammatical structures in it. But back to Trabuco here. I can think of a lot of things that I want to touch on. One of the things was, I thought that when I came here, Trabuco is wonderful. It has all the facilities, but especially in the summer, I thought, wouldn't it be nice if we had a swimming pool here? And so we had this reservoir that's up on the hill, which was filled with water for fire and that type of thing. And one of the monks, who became Swami Ganeshananda, Charles Rock at the time, he joined with me to see if we could convert the reservoir into a swimming pool. And we talked to Swami Prabhavananda about it, and he had no objection. And so the problem was that it was leaking, and you can't have a pool when the water is leaking. Well, we thought maybe we could fix it. So we drained the reservoir. In the meantime, with eager anticipation, we went to a place in Tustin that sold pool equipment and was used to taking care of people's swimming pools. And so we fixed it up, and then we filled the pool up again. But it was still losing about 15 inches a day of water, which is not very good. Well, fortunately, someone came along who later joined us, John Dan Crane, and he had work in construction. And so we had him look at the problem, and he somehow or other got this material you used for repairing dams. And he was able to seal this crack. And we filled it up with water. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? No leaks. It held the water. We had our swimming pool. And we had the pump going. And I felt like I was amused. I remember someone in Hollywood mentioned, do you know Trabuco? That's the country club of monasteries. He said, all they need is a swimming pool, not realizing that we already had one. And I remember going up there at night and lying on a raft and looking out over the lights and thinking, now this is the life of renunciation. So we enjoyed the pool, and it lasted for a long time. And like later, I think they put up a net and had water polo there. But it was great to have there during the summer. And one of the things we had here, I remember that the time they had cow grazing, when we had a lot more property before it was donated to O'Neill Park. We had the cows grazing around, and once we got a frantic call and say, your cows are loose, your cows are loose. And the cows had gotten up on the road, on Live Oak Canyon Road, wandering about. And so some of the monks had to run up there and to herd in the cows and bring them back onto the property. But that was quite an experience, having that. Another interesting thing that happened here was we used the bell for meals. And we joked that, well, people better not set their clocks by our bell. But it was heard for some distance. But we did use the bell regularly. And one time we went up, they rang the bell, no sound. Tried ringing it again, no sound. And someone had stolen the clapper on the bell. Somehow or other, someone had gotten up there. And still, it was very weird. But then we got it fixed up, of course, and it went on. And then I remember that we had a fire here. And the fire, we didn't know what was going to happen. The fire was coming up. And the monks were going out to try to see what they could do. And the firefighters, the professional firefighters came. And they more or less brushed the monks to the side. And so they more or less observed what the firefighters were doing. But I was sent to go up on the hill where the reservoir is sort of a lookout. And I remember looking out and seeing the fire coming from the other way, and I yelled down, and the fire is coming, the fire is coming. But anyway, things kind of settled down. And there was a lot of things that was burned, but it came back several years later. But that was rather exciting because it happened about 2 years after I joined. And to have that. And then we had the flood. We had the floods. One time here it kept raining. And it kept raining. And it still kept raining. And we went around saying 40 days and 40 nights. Because we didn't know when it was going to stop raining. The road was washed out. We had to put the car at the gate. We had to get there by Jeep. I remember one day we were going to go into Los Angeles to go to the opera. And I thought, what an interesting way to go. We first had to go by Jeep and then get the car to drive on into the city. So that was an experience but finally the rain did stop. And it worked out quite well. And then Brahmavananda Cottage. When I came, there was no cottage there. There was a little house called, and because we had someone in there called Sam, we called it Sam's house. And it was built during the college days as an overflow place where visitors could stay. And I had a little workshop in there because some reason or other, I remember that John Yales, who became Swami Prabhavananda, had the bookshop in Hollywood, and he wanted me to make some Ganeshas that, not as original as it sounds. We poured it into a mold, and I touched them up with a little bit of paint and coloring. They were sold in the bookshop in Hollywood. So I had a little workshop down there where I did it, and that was fun. And then when Swami Prabhavananda came up here from Hollywood to supervise the construction of Brahmananda Cottage and renovation of the shrine, originally the shrine was 2 tiers, and then it was made down as it is today with just 3 tiers it was originally, and then to 2 tiers. And then they worked on Brahmananda Cottage, and I remember we were each assigned to work there for an hour a day. And I can't remember exactly what I did. All I remember is carrying things to and from as they worked. But it was very nice and quite a lot of fun to see the cottage spring up and have a very nice place now that Swami Prabhavananda could come and the visiting Swamis could come. And that was quite good. But my main work that I did here was more or less in the literary field. At the time, Cliff Johnson, who later became Booma, and he had a background in that way, and he lived here at Trabuco, and he was working on the magazine. At the time, we had a magazine called Vedanta in the West, and Cliff was actively working on that, and I was his assistant. So not only I would review articles and type up articles for him and proofread it, and then he decided that he was going to write a book. The book was called Vedanta, an Anthology, and it's still available through Amazon. And it was a collection of all the writings on Vedanta from the very beginning scriptures, clear up on in to Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, and direct disciples, and the modern. It's quite a good book, and I've worked on it and typed up the manuscript and did the proofreading. I remember every time we had visitors who came to Trabuco, I would nab them, and they would do copy holding for the book. And that was one of my main things there while we were putting on the book. And then Swami Prabhavananda gave me an interesting project, and that was to look over some letters that he had collected. And these letters came from Francis Leggett. Now, Francis Leggett was the daughter of Mr. Francis Leggett, who was the first president of the Vedanta Society of New York. And of course, Vivekananda started that center. And he had this estate, Ridgely Manor, where they would go. And somehow or other, Swami Prabhavananda had received from Frances Leggett all the letters. She was writing a book called Late and Soon about the early days and her contacts with people who came to Vedanta. And in Late and Soon, there were a lot of research she had done, and she had gathered letters. Now, we always hear about like letters from Vivekananda, people like that, but she had gathered letters of friends and disciples in the West that had known Vivekananda, and they were writing to each other about Vivekananda, which was quite a treasure trove. And I was given the task of going over all these letters, looking through them, typing up what might be valuable material for research, and that was great fun to be able to go over, although sometimes it was rather difficult to decipher their handwriting. Especially remember Sarah Bull, who was Swami Vivekananda's great benefactor up in Boston. I remember I had to read her letters like that to find out what she was writing. But most of all, it was quite interesting. I got completely caught up with Tontine. Tontine Josephine MacLeod was one of Vivekananda's staunchest devotees. And there were letters about her, by her, and references. And I got very interested in her because she had been with Vivekananda more places, both in America and in India, than anybody else. And she was with him for 7 years after she met him first in New York in 1895. She stayed in touch with him for many years, and after she died, she became a great benefactor for the society and for the order in India, and did many things for them. So I got quite interested in her. And so these letters led me to do some research. I wanted to do research. I was quite interested in Vedanta in America. Previously, I'd gone to Chicago and done some research, and I wanted to go to the Art Institute. I knew that the Art Institute was where the Parliament was held, but no one seemed to know where exactly in the building itself where the Parliament was held, the two auditoriums, so I did research there. But then I went to Ridgely. Now, Ridgely Manor, my mother and I, one summer, we went out to visit all the places in the Northeast where Vivekananda had gone. And so the crowning place that we visited, after visiting Thousand Island Park and visiting the place in Maine where he had gone to Greenacre, and then even to Camp Percy, the camp in New Hampshire where Vivekananda had visited, we were invited to come to Ridgely to have lunch with Frances Leggett. And since I'd been going over these letters, I was very, very excited. And so we went to Ridgely. Later, Ridgely became one of the Vedanta centers, and it is still today one of the centers. But at that time, Frances Leggett herself lived there. And she invited us to lunch. Very nice, very informal. She said, "Now, I know you'd like to look about the place, so go look anywhere you want. I've got to get our lunch." So we just wandered all over the place there. And then she looked at me. She had known I was interested in Tontine. And she said, "I want you to know that Tontine and I never got along." Then I asked her, "Well, do you have any memories of when Vivekananda came to Ridgely?" Because she had been just a little girl. And now I talked to one of our devotees in Santa Barbara, Prasanna, who had some memories because she was living there at the time. And I told her, well, I talked to Prasanna and she had some memories. "Do you have any?" I said, "Prasanna, how could she remember? I'm older than her and I can't remember." But then she kind of brushed me off. But we had a very nice lunch and a nice visit with her. Then it was time to leave, and I said, "Well, do you have any pictures of Tontine that I might be able to see?" "I think the ones that have been published are good enough," she said to me. But then she left the room. And she came back. And she came back with some pictures. And not only did she come back with some wonderful pictures of Tontine, she came back with some pictures of Vivekananda that had belonged to Tontine. Because later, much later, Tontine had set up a little room to Vivekananda at Ridgely. And then when I got up to go, she gave them all to me. And I looked through them, and one of them solved the mystery. Because the standard picture of Vivekananda, you know, sitting in meditation, very formally, no one quite knew where that was taken. They didn't know if it was taken right after a talk, a lecture, or professionally taken in a studio. Well, I found in these pictures that there were proofs of that picture that had been taken in a studio. So it more or less proved that that picture that's worshipped all over the world was taken in a studio. So I had this material, and I brought it back and gave it over to Swami Chaitanananda, who was the assistant here at that time. And he was very interested in doing research and later wrote a lot of books and is now the head of the Vedanta Society of St. Louis, and gave the material to him. But it was quite valuable then to have gone to these different places and to have experienced it, and of course to have all this treasure trove of it. And later I went back to Ridgely on a visit, and I found somewhere in another house there where the Swamis had stayed a recording of Tontine, and nobody knew that it existed. And we found this actual recording in her own words. And I remember that she was going to say when she first came, she came and heard Vivekananda, and the first word was truth, the second word was truth, and everything he said was truth. And she had followed him and listened to him for 7 years, and every word was truth. And to hear that coming from her voice, and you can hear part of this recording on a DVD that we sell in the bookshop in Hollywood called Vivekananda as We Saw Him. And you can also hear other people talking about Vivekananda, including Cornelia Conger in Chicago, who knew her when she was just a little girl and Vivekananda was at the Parliament. And when I was doing my research in Chicago, I had the benefit of hearing her in person. And that was very, very nice. But I could go on with these other memories. There were quite a few that I had, and briefly just touch on them. One thing was I was in the orchard, and that was fun. They decided, let him drive the tractor and see how it goes along in the orchard. Before, I was just watering the plants in the orchard. But then to put me on the tractor, well, it only lasted for 1 day, but as soon as I got on the tractor, I started knocking down things. So they decided, no, maybe he shouldn't be on the tractor. But that was quite it. And then later, after having been at Trabuco all this time, and it was decided after my father died, and we had this little budding center in Kansas City, that I might go back and stay with my mother. So I went back to Kansas City after my father died, and was a little bit just wondering where I should be. I mean, I loved Trabuco. I was wanting to live the monastic life and everything, but there with my mother in the Vedanta Center. So I had 2 Swamis. One when we visited in London and said, "Oh, you're in Kansas City now, are you? Well, that's where you should be." And then I remember talking to Swami Shraddhananda, who was the head of the center in Sacramento. And he said to me, "You stay in Trabuco. We need to expand. I mean, you stay in Kansas City. We need to expand." And so I decided that I should. And then when Swami Swaminanda became head of the Vedanta in Southern California, I remember he came and visited us in Kansas City. And later, much, much later, after my mother died in 1993, he came and he made several trips to Kansas City while I was living there. And he invited me to come in Kansas City, come to Hollywood and live there after my mother died. So in 1993, I came to Hollywood. You know, I'd been away for too long to be still on the books of the order. And so I consider myself now as a lay brother. My name is Atma. When I took Brahmachari in, I believe it was in 1971. And so I'm called Atma, although I am really, as I say, I consider myself a lay brother. But in conclusion, I'd like to say that what Trabuco gave to me, and Trabuco gave me two great gifts. When I came to Trabuco, I'd just been used to trying to follow the spiritual life in Kansas City, and then having the great experience of being immersed in the spiritual atmosphere that the surroundings may have changed, but everything here at Trabuco is the same. I always feel when I come here I'm in a time warp. And then what I felt, really to my surprise, when I back to stay in Kansas City, I felt that I was able to carry on my spiritual practice just as I had when I was living here. And I felt like the atmosphere that I was able to get from Trabuco had stayed with me. And that was the greatest gift that I had, that I was able to take what I got from here back with me. And that was really quite a blessing, and I never would have had it without my years at Trabuco. And then, of course, the blessings of Swami Prabhavananda, that all my time here at Trabuco was under his guidance. And then as far as my personal instruction, I joined just in time, because if I had joined just a few years later, I would have gotten into his sick period, and I wouldn't have been able to have seen him as often. But all my training that I got was under Swami Prabhavananda. And so those two blessings enabled me to more or less take this atmosphere of Trabuco with me, and to be able to be away from the centers and that for so long. That was the great gift that Trabuco gave to me. And thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or anything, I'd be happy to talk to you in the library afterwards.